I guess I better not move around too much, otherwise Trevin's going to be chasing me with the camera all over the place. So I'm going to open up with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I would just ask that you would use me to deliver your message for whoever's listening. That's this in your name. All right. I'm going to be a little bit interactive here. Ellensburg, when you're listening, throw out your answers. That's okay. You're not going to hear what's being said in here. It'll work the same. I'm going to describe a situation that I'm sure you can all relate to. Let's say you're at the hardware store, grocery store, doesn't matter. You're out and you're sitting there chatting with the clerk as she's checking you out. And she says, oh, well, let's say it's Monday. Oh, well, how was your weekend? Oh, it was pretty good. Went to church, went fishing, whatever it is that you do on Sunday. And she asks, oh, what church do you go to? Oh, the Adventist church. Adventist? How do they respond? What's the next question after that? Next question, next comment. Okay, maybe, Mom. Okay, something about Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. Are you one of those people that don't celebrate Christmas? Yeah, right, something like that. Okay, cult, maybe. Those people that are familiar with Adventists, what do they say? I said familiar. Maybe their weird is true though. Oh yeah, you're one of those people that don't eat meat, right? You're one of those veganazis, maybe. Have you ever encountered somebody that said, Adventists, they're the kindest people that I know? Sometimes, yeah, I've come across a couple. The question is, why isn't that more common? Why isn't that the response that everybody has? And I will admit, we're 30 out of several million, right? So I'm not advocating that we're going to be able to change the entire culture of the church overnight, but take control of what you can control. So, probably the most common response is people that are tangentially familiar. Oh yeah, you're one of those, you're LDS, right? Sometimes, probably the most common response is, yeah, I knew, I've known some Adventists. They really knew their Bible. They knew their Bible really well. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, they're the kindest and most generous people that I know. But I think that we are probably better known for being Bible thumpers than anything else. That would be my guess. So I will say, and I think it's not bad to know your Bible by any means, but I don't know if that's what we necessarily want to be. That's not what we want to come first and foremost in people's mind. Okay, and I think we all recognize that. So the question is, how do we change that? All right. I think, at least historically, as a church, we've had a tendency to emphasize the doctrines that make us distinct, right? And I think that may be part of the reason that we tend to be lumped in with the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever. And there was a movement back in 60s, 70s, somewhere in there, where the church attempted to integrate itself more closely with mainstream Protestantism. Not a bad thing. I'm sure I've heard people on both sides of the issue. But I think the point is that we have a tendency to focus on what the differences are. They ask, why do you go to church on Saturday? Well, if they ask the question, then it's okay, and you can, go through and say, oh, well, if you'd like a Bible study, I'm happy to give it to you. But if they say, oh, well, yeah, I go to the Nazarene church, like, oh, well, that Sunday isn't the right day to be going to church on, right? We have a tendency to emphasize the differences rather than focusing on similarities. And David Ashrick gave a sermon a couple of years ago it was probably in response to the political situation going on at the time, but the title of the sermon was Build Bridges, Not Walls. And politics aside, the message still stands, right? And he goes through, and it's a really good sermon to go back and listen to. Maybe 3 or 4 years old. But his point is that we have similarities with everybody, right? Muslim, pray 4 or 5 times a day, don't eat pork, right? Jews, I don't need to list the similarities there, right? Go to church on Sabbath. It doesn't, if you become familiar with the people around you and actually become interested in what they have to teach you, then you can start to identify those differences and say, oh yeah, that's kind of like we do things, maybe the same way. Maybe, oh yeah, and it's a little bit different here, but focus on the similarities rather than the differences. Now this goes back to, I guess, kind of the crux of what I want to drive at here is, why do we exist as a church? Okay, proclaim the end time message. Share the love of Jesus. Okay. Okay. So I think that all of those fit into the purpose. I think that James is probably closest to the mark in that our entire purpose here is to act as effectively, it is to proclaim a message, but it's not necessarily a verbal message. It's to present people with the opportunity or opportunities to get to know God, right? Now, I think we should be asking ourselves, what is the best way to do that, right? Because if that is our purpose, right, and maybe it's not, maybe. Let's go through scriptures here. Isaiah 42, verses 6 and 7. Would somebody read that? Somebody in Ellensburg, read it out too. Pause the video if I go too fast. Isaiah 42, verses 6 and 7. Okay. Who is this passage talking about? Jesus? I would say so. So the more commonly quoted passage here is from Isaiah 61, which pretty much echoes the same thing. And that's the passage that Jesus quotes in the synagogue in Nazareth when he says, I'm here to proclaim the acceptable day of the Lord, right? And he goes through and he quotes Isaiah 61, but this passage in Isaiah 42 has a lot of the same characteristics. Okay, so yes, I think that this passage is talking about Jesus, but it was not, God's intent was that it would apply to Israel as well. Okay, and some of you may be thinking, whoa, you're reading way too much into that passage. This is clearly a messianic passage, right? That was Jesus's job. That's not necessarily our job. Like, well, maybe, but I think that the Bible clearly states that it is our job. Even within the context of that passage, there's an argument to be made that it's supposed to be that God's talking about Israel when he talks about his servant, or a couple verses earlier. But if you don't believe me, let's go to Acts chapter 13. And let's start in verse 44. Okay, so to just set the context here, that Paul and Barnabas are out touring Asia Minor, and they are bouncing around from town to town, and they wind up in Pisidia. And they go in and they start preaching in the synagogue, or talking with people in the synagogue after the end of the regular services. The Jews, the religious authorities, are not happy with them. Typical story. And most of the people love them. Okay. So starting in verse 44, read through verse 47, somebody besides Al. I've set you for a light to the Gentiles, right? That is God's command to us. Now, I think historically we've interpreted that as proclaiming the end time message, right? Not necessarily wrong. I think that's an aspect of it. But I think we should probably be honest with ourselves and ask how many people are actually dying to know what the message of Daniel and Revelation are right now. There are some out there, and I'm not saying that we should just throw out what we know about Daniel and Revelation, but we need to actually figure out what it is that people need. If we go back and read that passage in Isaiah, he says, "I'll make you a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles." Okay, what does that mean? The passage explains itself. To open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. Now, it's easy to apply a spiritual lens to that and say, oh yeah, we're supposed to open the eyes of people that don't know the truth, right? I need to go out and I need to explain to them about the investigative judgment and the millennium and all this kind of stuff. And sure, maybe they've got some knowledge that they didn't have before if they sit and listen to you long enough to get through it. But the passage is saying that there are needs that people have, and we're there to meet them. Now, admittedly, it can be difficult, especially in this country right now, to identify what needs people have, because there are very few people that actually lack access to basic necessities, right? It used to be, there's people that need shelter, there's people that need food, and those people still exist, and this church is meeting those needs for people in this community. So I'm not saying that we're doing everything wrong by any means, but I think that there's a larger segment of the population that universally that has a need that we don't necessarily do a great job of addressing. In the Sabbath school, I had to bite my tongue a little bit this morning, otherwise I would have given the sermon before it was time. But we were talking about, as usual, how the downfall of society and how technology is wrecking everything. Now, I want you to just ignore what you know about society for right now, and I'm going to throw out some facts. Okay. So in 1960, 20% of households did not have a telephone. Okay. In 1960, 70% of the US population lived in urban areas. Okay. Still a fairly large percentage. Fast forward to today, 2021, I think 97% of American adults have a cell phone, 85% have a smartphone, compared to 20% that didn't have a phone in their house 60 years ago. Okay. Rather than 70% of people living in urban areas, it's now 83%. Okay. So we live next to more people. We can talk with people anywhere, everywhere, more often than we want, maybe. I know some people that always complain when the phone goes off. Some of you can probably relate. So we have the opportunity to connect with more people. Sometimes one would think, just looking at those statistics, that we would be forced to connect with more people. Yet at the same time, despite what our expectations might be based upon those trends, there are, let me get the right number here. Oh, and in case you were interested, a 3-minute international call in 1960 cost $12, which is the equivalent of $100 today. So, yeah, some of you may remember making or not making those calls. And now you can video chat with somebody in Western China using satellite internet for free, basically. Where am I at? Okay, so I must have missed my stats here. Oh, no, here we go. 2021 survey of US adults. So keep in mind the opportunities that we have to connect with people all over the place, right? I didn't even mention Facebook and Twitter and the hundreds of people that we communicate with one way or another every day. there's been an ongoing study by Cigna, which I think is affiliated with Pfizer, some medical company. Anyway, they've been conducting a historical survey of loneliness trends, so self-reported feelings of loneliness in the U.S. How many people do you think report feeling lonely some or all of the time? U.S. population throughout 100%, 82%. Okay, 58% in 2021. That's actually, and unless you think that it's COVID that's caused that, it's actually down about a percentage point from 2019. So think about that. In the U.S., 3 in 5 people report feeling lonely some or all of the time. Okay, that's up substantially from 1960. Now, everybody has got their own opinion on why it is that society is breaking down. I heard people calling their smartphones the devil box this morning. So whatever you think the reasons are, I think that we offer at least a partial cure to that. Okay. And lest you think, which demographic do you guys think is the most lonely as a fraction of the population? Teenager? Nailed it. Okay. Yeah, the younger you are, the more likely you are to report feeling lonely some or all of the time, which is weird because you would think those people would be more connected than anybody, right? But there does appear to be an inverse correlation between technology use or social media use and feelings of loneliness. I'm not here to tell you that correlation and causation, we don't need to go into that. But I am going to relate to you guys some of the reasons why I have remained in the church over the last 10 years. So what would it be? 8 years ago, went off to school in Moscow, Idaho, for those of you that may be watching online and thinking I went to Russia. So not that far from home, about 3 hours, but completely, new environment. A lot of people, when they go off to college, they're out from underneath their parents' thumb and they can go and do whatever they want. They rebel, right? So, naturally, it's like, well, Errol's was down at WSU 8 miles down the road. Well, Errol's going to the Pullman Church, so I'll go and check out the Pullman Church and see what's going on. I was there, and I already had a connection there at that church. But the reason that I kept attending that church in particular was because a guy named Phil Anderson came up to me. I'd been there about 2 or 3 Sabbaths, and he asked, "Hey, Jonah, I need some help putting down vapor barrier underneath the church. Can you help me out?" Like, yeah, I think Wednesday afternoon works for me. It fits in my class schedule. So I'm in there crawling around in the, I don't think there were any mouse nests in there, which is a step up from what I'm used to dealing with. But, rolling around there in the muck and the rocks underneath the church, laying out vapor barrier, and I've been there less than a month. And Phil kept me involved with either stuff that was going on at the church or stuff that was going on at his house. I've slept at his house how many times, even after driving back from Colorado, I called Phil up and said, "Phil, I'm coming through, can I stay at your house?" "Oh yeah, sure, well, throw out your sleeping bag in the living room." Phil always found a way to, and it wasn't just me, Phil always found people and he worked as the greenhouse manager there at the University of Idaho. So he was always talking with people, and very few of those people came to church, mind you, but he always found a way to integrate them into what he was doing and to, steer the conversation maybe towards God a little bit, bring it up. I think sometimes we get overly concerned about whether or not somebody that we've been working on actually makes it into the church. And I don't know that that's the right metric to be using, because maybe somebody that's, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is some, a pagan, Satan worshiper that, thinks that all Christians are the devil, or the anti-devils or whatever. I don't know entirely what's in their mind. Let's say that's 0. And over here is, somebody, a pastor, let's say, the perfect pastor. So scale of 0 to 10. And, maybe, so on that scale, somebody that actually is coming to church semi-regularly might be a 7 or an 8. Well, we think that we've been completely ineffective if we take somebody that was at maybe a 2 or a 3 and get them to a 4 or 5, but they're still not, from our perspective, it just looks like, well, I tried and they're still not coming to church, right? Well, you don't know actually how far along that scale you've brought them unless you actually maintain that relationship with them. And the best way to do that isn't necessarily to bring them to church, because I will point out, church is not actually a social club. The structure of the service is not such that we are actually interacting with people unless we've got fellowship meal. And that's why fellowship meal is so valuable, is because it actually provides you the opportunity to sit and talk with people rather than sitting here and listening to me talk at you. Okay. So I guess the point I'm making is find a way, find somebody that God places on your heart, and that's, you've got to be sitting there and, talking with God. It's like, God, is this somebody that I need to actually invest a lot of time and effort into? If he says yes, though, ask them to do something with you, right? A lot of times they'll say yes, but if you expect them to reach out to you, kind of, pardon the language, but it might be where two fools met, right? If nobody says anything, then two ships passing in the night. But if you reach out to them, not because you're trying to get them into church, but because you care about them, right? If you care about them and you make that clear, because people can smell ulterior motives, it's a gift. And and oftentimes it's, if you invite them to church, they sense an ulterior motive. It's like, oh, you want me to become one of you? Well, don't invite them to church. Let them ask you about church, right? If they're the ones that initiate that conversation, then that's a door that's been opened. I don't lead with that, though. Another story. Down in Colorado, Golden is not a very big town, but it's attached to the rest of Denver. So imagine moving over to Seattle, kind of a similar deal. And I'm out here, I have down there for grad school for about 2 weeks, I didn't even have a place to stay. So I'm sitting there and I found a lovely lady. She's actually in rehab right now, but it sounds like she's doing okay, but she's about 85 years old. But I went to the prayer meeting down there and, hey, I'm looking for a place to stay. And I'd called, 14 different places, and I got a call back from one. And after the prayer meeting, she comes up to me and says, oh yeah, you're welcome to, I've got a room that's opening up in a week. Well, perfect. Prayer answered. Way cheaper than any other place I would have found anyway. So God answers prayers if you come to prayer meeting, I guess, is the moral of that side story. But so I'm down there, and I'm going to the same church that she is at the time being, because it feels kind of weird. It's like, well, I had wanted, because Colorado, Denver area, lots of different churches around. I'd kind of wanted to church hop a little bit, at least to start with. Anyway, I get down there and start attending that church there in Golden. And I think it was the second Sabbath I was there, the gal that was in charge of the junior Sabbath school class asked me if I would be willing to help out. Well, I have a chronic problem that I'm unable to say no. Jake will attest to that. That's why I'm up here right now. But anyway, I say, yeah, sure, I'll help you out time and again. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, I don't really want to get tied down here, but I'll help if I'm here. So she says, well, next Sabbath, come on down. And so I show up next Sabbath. I'm sitting there as a kind of a fly on the wall in the class. And then once the class is over, she turns to me and says, you're it. So for the next 2 years, I was teaching the children's Sabbath school class until COVID hit. So that's not necessarily the best approach, but right. But the point being is that if you find ways to get people involved, whether it's at church, whether it's with something you've got going on, that gives you the opportunity to build that relationship. Okay, so it's very easy, and I think this is I think technology is somewhat to blame for the feelings of loneliness, because it's so easy to not interact with anybody face to face anymore. COVID was a prime example of that. How long did you go where you saw maybe 1-2 people in any given day, and your interactions may have been pretty short, but everybody still survived and made it through it, right? I'm not discounting the people that actually died from the illness, but all of you that are sitting here, nobody was lacking for available services at that point in time. So unfortunately, then the technology advanced to the point where we could allow ourselves to become more withdrawn. And I think that's where a lot of people are right now. I didn't give you the number, but if you want more 18 to 24-year-olds in this church, 80% of them report feeling lonely summer all of the time. That's 4 in 5. You can't find 4 in 5, 80% commonality across any demographic on anything. So if you're looking for needs that need to be met in the community, and part of this can be addressed at the church level, but I think ultimately it needs to start with each and every one of us. And I'm not saying that I'm the most social person out there. I've been accused of being antisocial a time or two. But so that being said, it's something that we can all work on. Some of us are better at it than others. Phil Anderson was a master at it. But the point being is we all have relationships in our lives, which means that it is possible for us to actually build relationships with other people. So you can't say, well, I'm just no good at it. No, I promise you, it is possible for you to do it. Just invest a little bit of effort and time into it. And then you never know what's going to happen. Maybe somebody that you found on the street is going to be up here preaching one day. So with that in mind, I think I'm kind of surprised when I asked what the purpose of the church was, nobody brought up the Great Commission, because that I would have thought that's where people would automatically go to. Yeah, Jesus told all his, everybody in the church to go out and teach all nations and baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I don't like the King James translation on that, though, because the King James translation says, go therefore and teach all nations. The Greek actually says, go out and disciple all nations. What does it mean to disciple people? Jesus had disciples, right? He went on a 3-year camping trip with them, right? Jesus didn't sit there and have a Bible study, have 20 Bible studies working through the baptismal, lesson or whatever it is, and then said, oh yeah, and by the way, you're baptized, now go out and make other disciples. No, he spent time with them. He ate with them. He slept with them. He invited himself to their houses, right? Go out there and find ways to interact with people. And then, hopefully, your interactions are going to show them, at least in part, what a relationship with Jesus can look like, right? And let them be drawn to you. Don't try and drag them along by the nose, okay? It's really easy to just sit there and think, oh yeah, I'm going to give this person Bible studies, and then it's their choice whether or not they decide to come to church. Well, it is their choice, but it's also our responsibility to adopt the best approach to actually show them the truth, which that's truth with a capital T, not truth not the Sabbath truth, not the investigative judgment truth. That's the truth about who Jesus is and what he's done in your life. And that can't be communicated with words. That's only communicated by experience. So I think I've probably given all of you and myself a little bit to think about today. And I'm not saying this is going to be an easy change. It's a complete change in the way that we tend to operate. But I think that we need to start somewhere. So your homework is to go out and start a conversation with somebody that maybe you wouldn't have talked to before. And some of you may be scared, but I promise you, it will build character. That's what my parents always told me when I didn't want to do something that they thought was good for me. So I think this will be good for all of us. Go out and talk with somebody that you wouldn't have talked to before. With that, let's close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I hope that we all have a deep and abiding relationship with you, something that we have to cultivate continually. And I would just hope that that would extend out to the people that we come into contact with every day, that we would we know that you want a relationship with them, and oftentimes you use us as the means to draw people in. So I would just pray that you would, when the time is right, you would impress upon our hearts, hey, go out and talk to this person, or make an offer, invite them over for dinner after church. I don't know what that's going to look different for everybody, and unfortunately, there's no standard procedure to work off of here, but that's part of the fun of it. So I just ask that we would be ever mindful of the people that you want us to talk to, and that we would look at them as souls that maybe have a relationship deficit, and that we can fill some of that gap and you can fill the rest. So I just ask that you would impress upon us who to talk to and what to say. I ask this in your name.